My name is Cato White. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in marketing strategy for technology companies in London. If you met me in a boardroom, you probably wouldn't remember much about me at first. I'm not the loudest voice. I don't interrupt. I don't fill silence just to prove I exist. I take notes. I ask precise questions. I look people in the eye when they answer. Most people assume that means I'm safe, or soft, or compliant. For years, I allowed that perception to work in everyone else's favor. At the company where this story took place, I was known as reliable, the one who would stay late without complaint, the one who would smooth over tension between departments, the one who could salvage a failing campaign quietly and let someone else present the win. What I wasn't known for was ambition, or confrontation, or power. And that misunderstanding is where this story begins. This is not a story about screaming matches or dramatic revenge. No one throws a glass. No one storms out. There are no viral moments or cinematic monologues. It's a story about something much quieter, about what happens when a manager publicly blames you for a failed product launch in front of your team, your peers, and eventually the board, while knowing full well he cut the campaign budget weeks earlier without telling anyone, and about what happens when you choose not to defend yourself immediately. Instead, you wait, you document, you observe who says nothing, and then, at the right moment, you display a single email, not angrily, not theatrically, just clearly. The board didn't yell. They didn't need to. They read, they understood, and in that silence, the truth rearranged the room. This story is about emotional justice, about the cost of being underestimated, about the difference between reacting and deciding. It's about how silence can be weakness until it becomes a strategy. And most of all, it's about what it feels like to watch people slowly realize they misunderstood you the entire time. I'm not telling this to embarrass anyone. I'm telling it because I know there are people listening who have been labeled too calm, too agreeable, too invisible. If that's you, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped correcting their assumptions and simply let the truth arrive on its own when I joined the company? No one questioned my competence. They just quietly categorized it. I was the strategist, the planner, the one who turned chaotic ideas into timelines, budgets, and measurable outcomes. I wasn't the visionary. I wasn't the rainmaker. I certainly wasn't the executive presence in the room. That role belonged to my manager, Daniel. Daniel was charismatic in a way that translated well in quarterly meetings. He used confident language. He gestured widely. He loved phrases like bold direction and market disruption. He rarely talked about risk mitigation or contingency plans. Those were my territory. In meetings, I would outline the campaign roadmap. He would summarize it in 3 sweeping sentences and present it as a unified leadership vision. It didn't bother me at first. I believed that work spoke for itself. And if I'm honest, I liked being behind the scenes. There's safety in it. When something succeeds, you know your fingerprints are on it. When something fails, you're rarely the first person questioned. Or so I thought. To them, I was steady, dependable, low drama. That word low drama followed me everywhere. She's easy to work with. She doesn't take things personally. She'll sort it out. It was meant as praise, but what it really meant was she won't push back. I was the bridge between departments. Sales trusted me because I translated marketing goals into revenue language. Product trusted me because I listened when they said timelines were unrealistic. Finance trusted me because my projections were conservative and rarely wrong. Daniel trusted me because I never embarrassed him. And in leadership meetings, that mattered more than accuracy. I remember one quarterly review where a campaign I had architected exceeded projections by nearly 18%. Daniel presented the results. He mentioned the team collectively. He did not mention me by name. Afterward, one of the board members shook his hand and said, "Strong leadership. Daniel?" Daniel smiled. I closed my notebook. Moments like that didn't wound me sharply. They accumulated quietly, like fine dust settling on a surface you don't examine often. No one ever openly disrespected me. It was subtler than that. When I raised a potential risk, it was reframed as cautious. When I asked for additional budget to support projected reach, it was called conservative planning. When I requested data transparency, it was labeled detail-oriented. All technically accurate, all slightly diminishing. In team settings, junior staff came to me for guidance. They confided in me about workload stress and unclear expectations. I absorbed it. I always absorbed it. Daniel, on the other hand, was the forward-facing face of confidence. He rarely dealt with the emotional fallout of unrealistic targets. That, too, landed on my desk. I told myself this was leadership, just a different style of it. Quiet leadership. But here's the truth. I had trained them to expect my silence. I didn't interrupt when Daniel paraphrased my ideas without attribution. I didn't correct him when he shifted timelines publicly after I'd advised against it. I didn't challenge him when he assured stakeholders that budget flexibility wouldn't be an issue, even when I knew it would be, because I believed loyalty meant protecting your manager in public and clarifying in private. And in private, Daniel was always agreeable. Good point, Cato. You're right. We should consider that. Let's revisit it. But revisiting rarely happened. To everyone watching, we looked aligned, balanced, functional. What they didn't see was that alignment was built on my restraint. I was the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't escalate. And over time, that reputation hardened into expectation. If there was tension in a meeting, I would smooth it out. If there were a budget shortfall, I would reallocate creatively. If there was a missed milestone, I would adjust messaging. I became the safety net. And here's the thing about safety nets. People forget they're there until they fail. Before the launch, that would change everything. I wasn't invisible. I was indispensable, but in a way that made it very easy to assume I would always absorb the impact. And that assumption was about to be tested. The first cut didn't look like a cut. It looked like a scheduling adjustment. We were 6 weeks out from a major product launch, the biggest of the year, a new AI-driven feature that leadership had been teasing in investor calls for months. The roadmap had been finalized. Creative was in production. Paid media slots were reserved. Influencer contracts were drafted. It was tight, but controlled. Then Daniel forwarded me an email from finance with a single-line note. We'll need to reduce the campaign budget by 30%. Adjust accordingly. No context, no meeting, no discussion. 30%. I stared at the number for a long time. Not because it was shocking I'd seen last-minute cuts before, but because of the timing. At 6 weeks out, most of our high-impact channels were already negotiated. Pulling out would incur penalties. Scaling down would reduce reach significantly. I walked to Daniel's office. He was leaning back in his chair, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, confident posture, casual tone. I saw the email. I said, "Yeah," he replied lightly. "Tight quarter. We'll lose our top-tier placements," I said, "and the influencer tiering won't hold. We'll need to reposition expectations." He waved a hand. "We'll make it work." That phrase, "we'll make it work." It will impact projected acquisition by at least 22%. I added carefully. If we don't reset performance targets now, it will look like underperformance. Daniel paused. Not because he hadn't heard me, but because he didn't like the implication. "Let's not be defeatist," he said. "Creative can compensate. Creative cannot compensate for 30% less reach." But I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded slowly. "I'll revise the plan." As I walked back to my desk, something subtle shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. This wasn't collaborative. It wasn't strategic. It was reactive optics management. I opened my black leather notebook and wrote the date. Under it, I noted, budget reduced 30%, no stakeholder alignment, risk flagged. I wasn't documenting for leverage. Not consciously. I was documenting because it grounded me. It gave structure to uncertainty. The revised plan took 2 days. I reallocated funds to preserve mid-tier channels with better conversion efficiency. I scaled down launch week amplification. I adjusted the forecast model. And then I requested a meeting with Daniel to align on revised expectations before presenting to the executive team. He skimmed the updated slides quickly. "Looks fine," he said. "We don't need to emphasize the budget cut in the exec meeting." I looked at him. "They'll ask about projections. We'll frame it as optimization." I felt that small internal tightening again. The part of me that knew clarity was being traded for comfort. "If targets remain the same publicly," I said evenly, "the narrative will be that marketing underdelivered." He smiled. "You worry too much." Maybe I did. Or maybe I was the only one worrying in the right direction. In the executive meeting, Daniel presented the revised launch strategy. He spoke about agility, about learner efficiency, about creative amplification. No mention of the 30% reduction. When the CFO asked whether projections were holding steady, Daniel nodded. We're confident in performance. I didn't interrupt. I could have, technically, but interrupting your manager in a room full of executives carries a cost. And I had built my reputation on being composed, supportive, aligned. After the meeting, one of the directors pulled me aside. Are we really confident? She asked quietly. I met her eyes. It will be tight. She nodded. Keep me posted. That was the first small cut. Not the budget reduction, not even the unrealistic expectations. The cut was this. The moment I realized my caution was being reframed as pessimism, and my silence was being interpreted as agreement, and everyone else. They moved on because nothing had visibly broken. Yet, the strange thing about slow erosion is that it never announces itself. No one wakes up one morning and says, "Today, I will slowly diminish someone." It happens in tone shifts, in who gets credit, who absorbs risk. After the budget cut, the launch meetings became more frequent, more urgent. Daniel's energy intensified. He began using phrases like, "We can't afford hesitation." And this is where bold teams step up. Bold, apparently, meant optimistic. In one cross-functional call, I outlined the revised paid media projections. I explained that with the reduced spend, we'd likely see slower initial adoption, but stronger long-term retention if we nurtured mid-tier channels properly. Daniel jumped in before I finished. Let's keep the energy high, he said lightly. We're not forecasting decline, we're forecasting disciplined growth. It sounded good. It also subtly repositioned my realism as negativity. No one challenged it. Later, in a Slack thread, a junior marketer asked whether we should update the performance dashboard targets to reflect the new spend. Before I could respond, Daniel wrote, "Let's not lower the bar before we jump." I stared at that sentence longer than necessary. It was clever, motivational, and strategically dangerous. I replied carefully. Targets and budget alignment ensure accurate performance measurement. I recommend updating projections to reflect actual inputs. No emojis, no edge, just clarity. Daniel reacted with a thumbs up. The targets were not changed. That's how normalization works. A small override here, a subtle reframing there. Each time, I told myself it wasn't personal. It was a style difference, leadership philosophy, risk appetite. But patterns don't lie. In leadership sync meetings, Daniel began answering questions directed at me before I could speak. How's channel diversification looking? Oh, we're solid there, he'd say. Cato's team has it handled. Cato's team, technically correct, slightly distancing. When the head of sales asked whether the revised projections would affect their quota pacing, I opened my mouth to respond. Daniel leaned forward. We expect marketing to hit the numbers, he said smoothly. No concerns. No concerns. I felt something quiet inside me take note. After that meeting, one of my team members approached me. Are we actually expected to hit the original target? She asked, voice low. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't want to undermine leadership. I didn't want to create anxiety. We'll focus on controllables, I said. Execution matters, she nodded, but her eyes were searching. I had always protected upward. Now I was starting to realize I might also need to protect downward. And still I stayed calm. I rationalized. Maybe Daniel believed creative momentum would compensate. Maybe he genuinely thought confidence would drive performance. Maybe he didn't want to alarm stakeholders prematurely. Those are generous interpretations. But generosity without boundaries becomes permission. One afternoon, as we reviewed influencer contracts, I noticed something else. Daniel had removed the top-tier creator from the plan without telling me, quietly, no note, no discussion. That creator drove 14% of projected reach. I said, they were expensive. He replied, we'll allocate that budget to micro-creators. That changes the launch spike model. I said evenly, we'll adapt. It was always adaptable. I walked back to my desk and opened my notebook again. Top-tier influencer removed, no consultation. Risk to launch spike. I wasn't angry, not visibly, but something was becoming undeniable. Disrespect rarely begins with insults. It begins with an assumption. The assumption that you will adjust, that you will absorb, that you will not object. And each time I chose composure over confrontation, I reinforced that assumption. The truth is, I was complicit in my own invisibility, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed alignment mattered more than recognition. Until the day alignment would be weaponized against me, that hadn't happened yet, but the ground was softening, and I could feel it. There's a moment subtle, almost administrative, when you realize you've been assigned a role in someone else's narrative. Not the role you applied for, not the one in your job description, the one that makes everything else easier for them. For Daniel, I wasn't just the senior marketing strategist. I was insulating. If projections looked ambitious, I would tighten the model. If timelines slipped, I would rework sequencing. If stakeholders grew impatient, I would manage expectations. He got to be visionary. I got to be a stabilizer. At first, I told myself this was a balance. Every leadership team needs contrast, but balance implies mutual acknowledgement. What we had was a symmetry. The shift became undeniable during a pre-launch board prep session. The board was scheduled to attend the internal launch review, not common, but this product had been heavily teased to investors. Expectations were high. Daniel wanted a flawless narrative. "We'll position this as a market-defining moment," he said, pacing in the glass-walled conference room. Disruption, category leadership, aggressive growth. I sat at the table with my laptop open, projections displayed, with the revised budget. I began carefully. We should frame it as a strategic rollout, strong long-term adoption rather than explosive short-term acquisition. He stopped pacing. "That sounds cautious," he said. "It sounds accurate." A quiet beat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We don't need to lead with constraints." Constraints? That word again. As if budget reality were a philosophical inconvenience. "We'll maintain the original growth target in the presentation," he continued. "It signals confidence. It signals a benchmark," I replied. "If we miss it, that benchmark becomes a liability." Silence. The air in the room tightened just slightly. Then he said something that clarified everything. "That's why you're here, Cato. To make sure we hit it. Not to align it, not to recalibrate it, to hit it." The role had been assigned. I wasn't there to shape expectations. I was there to absorb the consequences if they weren't met. Later that week, an email went out to the broader team outlining launch responsibilities. Daniel's section was titled Executive Oversight and Strategic Direction. Mine was titled Performance Accountability. I reread that phrase several times. Performance accountability. Not a strategy, not cross-functional alignment. Accountability. It was subtle, professional, polished, and perfectly positioned. If the launch succeeded, it would validate the executive vision. If it underperformed, it would raise questions about performance execution. My performance execution! In team check-ins, Daniel began speaking in slightly more public tones. "We're all counting on marketing to deliver here. I trust Cato's team will make the numbers work. This is where operational excellence matters." Operational excellence. It sounded complimentary. It also quietly boxed me in. I began noticing how often my name appeared next to metrics, and how rarely it appeared next to decisions. Budget cut, executive decision, target unchanged, leadership alignment, influencer tier removal, strategic optimization. Underperformance, if it came, would be operational. Mine. I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't see it, but because confrontation without evidence is emotional, and I don't operate emotionally in professional spaces. Instead, I adjusted something internally. If I were being positioned as the accountable party, then I would need to ensure accountability was traceable. Not loudly, not defensively, precisely. I began forwarding confirmation emails to myself, saving time-stamped versions of budget approvals, documenting when risks were flagged and by whom. Not to retaliate, but to clarify. There's a difference. The role they assigned me was clear: reliable, useful, invisible, responsible. What they didn't realize was that responsibility, when documented properly, becomes leverage. And leverage, when used calmly, changes the narrative. They still believed I would absorb whatever happened next. I was starting to understand that absorption was no longer required. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Tuesday evening, alone in the office, under fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly unreal. Launch week was 4 days away. Most of the team had gone home. The office was quiet except for the low hum of the ventilation system and the faint echo of traffic from the street below. I was reviewing final dashboards, cross-checking tracking links, and making sure attribution windows were clean, routine, controlled, measured. And yet, there was a stillness inside me that felt unfamiliar. Earlier that day, Daniel had presented a final pre-launch update to the executive team. I had prepared the slides, adjusted the projections, reworded the narrative to emphasize agile scaling. When questions about risk came up, he answered them confidently. We've stress tested the model. We're comfortable with the targets. Marketing is fully aligned. Marketing, not we decided, not given the budget adjustment. Just marketing. At one point, the CFO asked directly, any constraints we should be aware of? Daniel didn't look at me. No significant ones. I felt that answer settle into the room like a contract. No significant constraints. After the meeting, no one pulled me aside this time. No quiet check-ins, no raised eyebrows. The narrative had solidified. This would either be a win or a performance problem. Mine, and yet, sitting at my desk that evening, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. For months, I had been operating under an unspoken belief that protecting alignment was the most mature choice, that absorbing tension prevented instability, that being low drama was leadership. But leadership without boundaries is eroding. I opened my black leather notebook and flipped back through the pages. Dates, notes, budget revisions, risk flags. Phrases like, targets not adjusted despite 30% cut. Influencer tier removed without consultation. The exec presentation omitted constraints. It wasn't a dramatic file. It was orderly, almost boring. But together, it told a clean story. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If this launch underperforms, will silence protect me or expose me? The answer was immediate. Silence would not be interpreted as integrity. It would be interpreted as ownership, not strategic ownership. Blame ownership. That realization didn't trigger panic. It triggered recalibration. I wasn't interested in public confrontation. I wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. I didn't want to win in a theatrical sense. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the narrative to match the reality of decisions made. And that requires one thing above all, timing. That evening, I did something small but deliberate. I compiled a single folder, clean, organized, chronological, original budget approval, revised budget reduction email, my response outlining the projected impact, slide versions before and after target alignment discussions. Nothing inflammatory, no commentary, just documentation. Then I closed the folder. I didn't send it to anyone. I didn't even rename it dramatically. It sat on my desktop, quietly labeled, Launch Internal Alignment. I shut down my laptop and stood up. The office lights flickered slightly as the motion sensors recalibrated. For the first time in months, I felt steady in a different way. Not compliant, not reactive. Intentional? The shift wasn't about exposing Daniel. It was about refusing to carry responsibility for decisions I did not make. And that's a subtle but powerful distinction. As I walked out of the building into the cool London air, I realized something else. I no longer needed to convince anyone of the risks. I only needed to ensure that when the results arrived, the context would arrive with them. Quietly, precisely, on my terms. Before that Tuesday, my silence had been habitual. After it, my silence became deliberate. There's a difference between not speaking because you're trying to keep the peace and not speaking because you're observing who benefits from your restraint. Launch week began with the usual choreography. Early morning status checks, Slack channels pulsing with last-minute creative swaps, sales requesting updated talking points, product confirming deployment windows. Externally, everything looked polished, confident, controlled. Internally, the numbers were already telling a quieter story. Day 1 acquisition was 18% below the original forecast. Not catastrophic, but significant. By day 3, the gap widened to 24%, exactly within the range I had projected when the budget was reduced. Daniel's tone shifted slightly in leadership sync. Let's not overreact to early data, he said. We're playing the long game. I didn't disagree. Early data can be volatile, but the volatility wasn't random. It was patterned. Mid-tier channels were performing steadily just as expected. But without the top-tier influencer spike and paid amplification, we lacked the launch surge that leadership had promised investors. I could feel eyes turning toward marketing in subtle ways. Questions began to narrow. Is creative resonating? Was the messaging too niche? Did we overestimate audience readiness? These weren't accusations. Not yet. They were exploratory. Daniel answered most of them before I could. He kept the language high level, vision oriented. We may need to optimize creative. Let's test variations. This is where operational agility matters. Operational, again, in previous months, I would have jumped in to clarify context, to remind the room of the budget reduction, to restate the revised projections I had shared privately. But now, I waited, not out of fear, out of alignment with my own strategy, silence. Used reactively, feels like suppression, silence. Used intentionally, feels like positioning. I continued executing, adjusting bids, refining audience segmentation, updating dashboards daily with transparent metrics. I ensured that every performance report included a line item clearly stating current spend level 30% below the original approved budget. No commentary, just a fact. Daniel didn't remove it. He also didn't mention it in the executive summaries. By the end of week 1, the underperformance was visible enough that the board requested a formal performance review session. I watched Daniel read the email on his phone during a meeting. His jaw tightened for half a second before smoothing out. "We'll walk them through optimization plans," he said. I nodded. That night, I didn't feel dread. I felt a quiet inevitability. The folder on my desktop remained untouched. I hadn't opened it once. I didn't need to, because the truth was no longer hypothetical. It was measurable, and here's what they never realized. I wasn't preparing to defend myself emotionally. I was preparing to present the alignment history factually. No raised voices, no dramatic reveals, just a timeline. The board performance review was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 7 days. 7 days of silence. 7 days of letting the numbers speak louder than defensiveness ever could. People often mistake calm for passivity. What they don't see is how much calculation can exist beneath it. Daniel still believed I would stand beside him, absorb the operational critique, and make it work afterward. He had no reason to believe otherwise. After all, I had never done anything different. Until now, there's a misconception about preparation. People imagine it as dramatic late-night plotting, whispered phone calls, elaborate strategies unfolding behind closed doors. What they never notice is the quiet kind, the kind that looks exactly like competence. In the 7 days leading up to the board review, I did nothing outwardly unusual. I attended meetings, I answered emails, I updated dashboards, I even offered optimization suggestions in leadership syncs. But internally, I shifted into documentation mode with a level of precision I had never needed before. Not emotional documentation, structural documentation. I began reconstructing the full decision timeline from the moment the original launch plan was approved. Original approved budget documented, original projected acquisition curve archived, email confirming 30% reduction timestamped, my written response outlining the projected 22 to 25% impact saved, slides showing my recommendation to recalibrate targets version history intact, final executive deck where targets remained unchanged archived. Each file was placed in the same clean folder. No annotations, no editorial commentary, just sequence. Because sequence is power. In parallel, I paid attention to something else language. In executive summaries, Daniel's phrasing had begun to shift subtly. We're analyzing marketing performance variance. We may need to revisit execution efficiency. We're assessing campaign effectiveness. He never explicitly blamed me. He didn't need to. Language sets direction long before accusations are spoken. I didn't counter it publicly. Instead, I began embedding clarity into every report. Under each performance dashboard, I added a standardized footnote. Performance is currently tracking within expected variance, given 30% budget reduction implemented on date. It was neutral. It was factual. It was impossible to interpret as emotional. No one asked me to remove it, but no one referenced it either. That told me everything. What they never noticed was that I also began speaking directly, but quietly, to two other stakeholders, the head of sales and the director of product. Not to complain, not to escalate. To align, I want to make sure you have full visibility into campaign inputs. I said in a one-on-one with sales, if quota pacing discussions arise, context will matter. He frowned slightly. Budget was cut. Right. Yes, I said calmly, 30%. Projections were adjusted accordingly at the time. His expression shifted not dramatically, just enough. I didn't realize targets stayed the same, he said. I flagged the variance. I replied, I just want everyone working from the same information. No drama, no accusation, just alignment. With product, the conversation was similar. If questions come up about adoption curve timing, I said, it's important to know amplification spend was reduced. She nodded slowly. That wasn't mentioned in the exec update. I know, I said, and I left it there. What they never noticed was that I was building a shared understanding horizontally, not vertically, because when truth travels laterally across departments, it becomes harder to contain. Meanwhile, Daniel remained focused on optimization narratives. Let's tighten creative, let's push email harder, let's increase urgency messaging. All valid adjustments, none addresses the structural constraint. I didn't argue. I executed. The numbers continued to track almost exactly within the revised projection model I had built weeks earlier. It was almost eerie. I would look at the dashboard in the evenings and see the line curve precisely where I had estimated it would land. Not worse, not catastrophic, just predictably below the publicly stated target. And here's the part no one ever sees. Preparation isn't about revenge. It's about refusing to be misrepresented. The folder on my desktop now contained 12 documents. 12 quiet pieces of context. The board meeting was 48 hours away. Daniel sent a calendar invite titled, Launch Performance Review, Alignment Discussion. Alignment. I smiled faintly when I read it, because alignment, finally, was exactly what I intended to deliver. The private reveal didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened the night before. I was at my kitchen table, laptop open, city lights diffused against the windows of my flat. The performance review deck was finalized. Daniel had added his executive summary slide at the front, confident tone, forward-looking language, references to optimization and lessons learned. There was still no mention of the 30% budget reduction. I wasn't surprised. What I needed to confirm wasn't whether he would include it. It was whether I had irrefutable clarity. So I opened the folder, not to reread every document. I already knew what was inside, but to ensure sequence integrity, date stamps aligned, threads intact, no missing context that could be misinterpreted. And that's when I saw it, not a new email, not a dramatic confession, just a thread I had skimmed weeks earlier. The original budget approval from finance had been confirmed in writing. Clear allocation, clear sign-off. Daniel had responded. Approved. We'll proceed at this level. 2 weeks later, the reduction email arrived. It had been sent directly to Daniel first. Not to me, not to the broader team. He had forwarded it to me with a short note adjust accordingly. But what I hadn't fully registered at the time was this. There had been a reply from him to finance before it was forwarded to me. I clicked into the thread history. There it was. Understood. We'll maintain original growth targets regardless. We can absorb the difference operationally. My hand stilled on the trackpad. Maintain original growth targets regardless. Not let's discuss recalibration. Not we may need to adjust projections. Regardless. He had made the decision. Explicitly, in writing, not impulsively, not under pressure in a meeting. Deliberately. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder and clearer than either. Responsibility had been defined. The board wasn't missing context because of oversight. They were missing it because it had been intentionally framed as unnecessary. And the most important part? The email was timestamped 3 days before I had presented revised projections recommending target adjustment, which meant my caution had not been pessimism. It had been corrected, and it had been overridden. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. This was the leverage, not a scandal, not misconduct. Alignment history. There's a powerful difference between saying, I warned you, and saying, here's the timeline. The former sounds defensive. The latter sounds factual. I copied the full thread into a clean PDF, included the metadata, no highlights, no annotations. Then I added it to the folder. 14 documents now. I didn't email it to anyone. I didn't confront Daniel privately. I didn't demand acknowledgement, because this wasn't about catching him off guard. It was about clarity in the right room. The board performance review was scheduled for 10 a.m. I already knew how the meeting would likely begin. High-level overview, framing around performance variance, gentle but pointed questions about execution efficiency. I would let it unfold. And when not if the question of target alignment arose, I would answer it calmly, with sequence, not to embarrass him, but to ensure that performance accountability was properly placed. That night, I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a few minutes. For months, I had been positioned as the operational backstop, the reliable absorber of miscalculations. Tomorrow, I will still be calm, still composed, but I would not be absorbent. The reveal wouldn't be dramatic, it would be precise. And precision, in rooms like that, changes everything. The morning of the board review, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was anxious, because I needed silence. There's a specific kind of clarity that only arrives before the world starts speaking at you. I made coffee, sat by the window, opened my laptop not to review the deck, but to look one more time at the email thread, not for reassurance. For alignment, I wasn't deciding whether the information was real. I was deciding whether I would use it. And that distinction mattered. There were multiple paths available to me that morning. I could stay silent, let the meeting unfold, absorb the performance critique, reiterate optimization plans, preserve surface harmony. That option would protect Daniel immediately. It would also quietly confirm the narrative that operational execution had fallen short. I could confront him privately before the meeting, forward the thread, ask why he hadn't disclosed it, force an internal acknowledgement. But private confrontation would create a he said, she said dynamic. It would also give him time to pre-frame the board conversation. Or I could do something else. I could allow the review to proceed naturally without interruption, and when the discussion inevitably narrowed toward performance accountability, I could introduce the timeline, not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. That third option carried risk. It would not humiliate him. I had no intention of doing that. But it would remove ambiguity. And once ambiguity disappears in a boardroom, power recalibrates. I closed my laptop and asked myself one direct question. What outcome am I protecting? Not my ego, not my reputation in the short term, my integrity. Integrity isn't loud. It doesn't shout. I told you so. It simply refuses to carry what doesn't belong to it. For years, I had believed loyalty meant containment, protect the narrative, smooth the edges, shield leadership from avoidable friction. But loyalty without mutual accountability becomes imbalanced, and imbalance, over time, erodes trust. The board meeting wasn't about blame, it was about accuracy. If I allowed inaccurate framing to stand in a room of decision makers, I would be participating in it. And participation is consent. By 9:30 a.m., I was seated in the conference room, the long oak table, glass walls, city skyline diffused in gray morning light. Daniel sat across from me, flipping through printed slides. He looked composed, professional, focused. He gave me a brief nod. "We'll keep it tight," he said. "Focus on optimization." I met his eyes. "Of course." I replied. There was no tension in my voice, because the decision had already been made. I wasn't there to optimize perception. I was there to present the sequence. The board members began filing in at 9:58. Measured footsteps, quiet greetings, laptops opening. The chair nodded toward Daniel. "Let's begin." He stood, confident posture, executive cadence. The first 15 minutes went exactly as expected. Overview, market context, performance variance, lessons learned. Then the CFO leaned forward slightly. "Help me understand something," he said calmly. "Were growth targets adjusted when budget inputs changed?" The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel paused for half a second, and in that half second, the path I had chosen solidified. This was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just precise. I placed my hands lightly on the table and prepared to answer. The CFO's question didn't sound accusatory. It sounded procedural. Were growth targets adjusted when budget inputs changed? Daniel answered first. "We maintained ambitious targets to keep the team focused," he said smoothly. "We believed operational efficiency could absorb the difference." Operational efficiency? I let the words settle. Then I spoke. "There was a recommendation to recalibrate projections at the time of the budget adjustment," I said evenly, "based on the 30% reduction. No change in tone, no emphasis, just a fact." The chair turned toward me. "Was that recommendation adopted?" "No," I replied. Daniel interjected lightly. "We discussed it, but ultimately decided confidence in execution warranted holding targets steady." Decided. I nodded once. Yes, the decision was to maintain original growth targets regardless of input reduction. Regardless. The word landed differently when I said it. The CFO looked down at his laptop. "Is that documented?" "Yes." I said. There it was. Not confrontation, invitation. I didn't immediately project anything onto the screen. I didn't rush to open the folder, because silence, when offered calmly, creates space. The chair folded his hands. For clarity, he said. Can we see the timeline of that decision? Daniel glanced at me, not sharply, not angrily, just assessing. I opened my laptop. I navigated to the folder labeled Launch, Internal Alignment, 14 documents. I selected the email thread, projected it onto the screen without commentary. Original budget approval. Daniel's acknowledgement, finance reduction notice. Daniel's reply, will maintain original growth targets regardless. We can absorb the difference operationally. My subsequent projection adjustment recommendation, the decision not to recalibrate. No highlights, no red circles, just sequence. The room went quiet in a way that feels different from awkward silence. This was processing silence. The CFO read carefully. The head of sales leaned back slightly. The chair scrolled through the metadata himself. No one looked at me. They didn't need to. The information spoke. Daniel cleared his throat softly. As I mentioned, we believed in the team's ability to deliver. No one challenged that statement, but no one affirmed it either. The chair looked up, not at Daniel, at me. Your revised projection model, he said. How close is current performance tracking to it? Within 2% variance, I replied, another small silence, because that detail reframed everything. This wasn't an operational failure. It was a predictable outcome. The CFO nodded slowly. So performance is aligned with adjusted inputs, not original targets. Yes, I said, no defensiveness, no triumph, just alignment. What happened next was subtle, but decisive. The language shifted. Not why didn't marketing deliver, but why weren't targets adjusted? Not what went wrong in execution. But how did this misalignment occur? Ownership recalibrated in real time. And I didn't add anything else. That was the discipline. It's tempting, in moments like that, to over-explain, to layer on emotion, to underline your foresight. I closed the email thread once the questions moved forward. Because the goal wasn't to prolong discomfort, it was to correct the narrative. By the time the meeting ended, no one had raised their voice. No one had accused anyone directly. But the board had clarity, and clarity shifts consequence. As we gathered our laptops, Daniel avoided eye contact for the first time since I'd known him. Not with hostility, with recalculation. I walked out of the room steadily. No adrenaline spike, no shaking hands, just a quiet internal confirmation. Silence had been a choice, and when I chose to speak, it had been precise. The consequences would not be immediate, but they had already begun. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They begin with tone. The morning after the board review, my inbox felt different. Not fuller, not urgent, just attentive. The CFO emailed requesting a copy of the revised projection model for future alignment calibration. The head of sales asked if we could meet to ensure cross-functional forecasting accuracy moving forward. Even the director of product scheduled a recurring sync titled Input-Output Transparency. Language had changed. No one referenced the email thread directly. No one replayed the moment in the boardroom. But the axis had shifted. Daniel, on the other hand, became quieter. In our weekly leadership meeting, he didn't open with his usual high-energy framing. He moved through the agenda items methodically, efficiently. When performance metrics came up, he said something he had never said before. Given input constraints, marketing performance is tracking as expected. Input constraints. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement in professional spaces is currency. Over the next 2 weeks, subtle structural changes began appearing. The board requested that any future budget adjustments include documented target recalibration discussions. A new slide template was introduced for executive presentations, input variance, and target alignment. I was asked to co-present quarterly projections directly to the board going forward. Co-present, not support, not prepared. Present. No one framed it as a demotion for Daniel. No one announced a redistribution of authority. But authority had been redistributed. In one private moment after a meeting, the chair stopped me near the exit. You handle pressure well, he said simply. Thank you, I replied. That kind of documentation, he continued, protects the company, not protects you. Protects the company. That distinction mattered more than praise ever could. Daniel and I had a one-on-one 2 days later. He closed the door, sat down, folded his hands. That meeting didn't need to escalate like that, he said. I held his gaze. It didn't escalate. A quiet pause. You could have discussed that email with me beforehand. I did, I said evenly. At the time it was sent. He didn't respond immediately, because we both knew that was true. There was no shouting, no defensiveness, just two professionals sitting in the aftermath of a clarified sequence. I was trying to protect momentum, he said finally. I was trying to protect accuracy, I replied. Neither statement was dramatic, but one had been omitted in front of the board. And omission, once exposed, reshapes trust. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's language became more collaborative in meetings. What does the model suggest? Let's review projections before locking targets. Cato, what's your assessment? Publicly, not as performance, as a necessity. The team noticed, even if they couldn't articulate why. Junior marketers began looping me directly into early-stage discussions. Sales referenced budget alignment proactively. Product asked for forecast validation before investor-facing statements. No one declared that something had changed, but they behaved as if it had. Consequences don't always remove someone from a role. Sometimes they remove assumptions, and the assumption that I would absorb misalignment quietly. That was gone, not because I had fought, but because I had documented, and documentation, when delivered without emotion, doesn't attack. It clarifies. If consequences begin with tone, regret begins with timing. About a month after the board review, Daniel requested a strategy off-site with just the two of us. A reset. He called it Tighten Alignment Before Q4. We booked a quiet meeting room overlooking the river, neutral ground, no audience. He came prepared printed decks, revised planning templates, and a new forecasting framework. I think we need to present a more unified front going forward, he said, sliding a document across the table. Less room for interpretation. Unified. The word would have landed differently a month earlier. Now, it felt reactive. I agree on clarity, I said calmly. That's always been my position. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not irritation, recognition. He continued, the board has become very focused on documentation. They're scrutinizing inputs more closely. Yes, I said, they should. Another quiet beat. I wasn't trying to put you in a difficult position, he said finally. I believed him. That was the complicated part. He hadn't woken up intending to sacrifice operational accuracy. He had wanted momentum, confidence, investor reassurance. But intention doesn't negate impact, and impact, once visible to a board, cannot be unseen. Over the following weeks, Daniel made visible efforts to course correct. He included budget slides up front in executive updates. He publicly acknowledged cross-functional decision-making. He asked for projection sign-offs in writing. He was trying to rebuild narrative discipline. But here's what he couldn't rebuild: unquestioned authority. Not because he had failed, because the sequence had revealed process gaps. The board began requesting direct model walkthroughs from me, without routing through him. Finance CC'd me directly on budget conversations. Sales asked me to validate growth statements before investor decks were finalized. Daniel wasn't excluded. He was no longer singular. That distinction is subtle and irreversible. In one leadership meeting, the CFO said something almost casually. Let's ensure no target is maintained regardless of input changes moving forward. Regardless, the room registered the word. No one looked at me. They didn't need to. After the meeting, Daniel lingered behind. I should have handled that differently, he said quietly. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't even fully formed, but it was honest. Yes, I replied. He nodded once. There was nothing to fix in that moment. No resolution conversation. No emotional clearing. Because the fix had already occurred publicly, and public recalibration changes private dynamics permanently. He began deferring to me more frequently in meetings, not performatively, practically. Cato, can you walk us through the impact model? Let's confirm with Cato before committing. Some might see that as restoration. It wasn't, it was a redistribution. Trust, once rerouted, doesn't flow back to its original path simply because behavior improves. And here's the quiet truth. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. The imbalance had been corrected not through confrontation, but through clarity. Too late to prevent scrutiny. Too late to maintain the old hierarchy. Too late to reframe the past, but not too late to operate differently going forward. What Daniel couldn't undo wasn't the board's awareness. It was my awareness. I had seen how easily silence could be repurposed. and I would never allow it to be interpreted as consent again. The real confrontation didn't happen in that off-site room. It happened weeks later, in a smaller setting, no board members, no executives. Just Daniel and me in a standard conference room before a quarterly planning session. He closed the door more deliberately than usual. "I want to clear something," he said. "There's a perception that I withheld context intentionally. I didn't respond immediately. I let him finish. That wasn't the intent," he added. "I was trying to keep the narrative strong." There it was again, narrative. I folded my hands on the table. "I don't think you were trying to harm anyone," I said calmly. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "But intention doesn't determine accountability." I continued. "Sequence does. No accusation, no raised tone, just structure." He exhaled through his nose, thinking. "You could have forced the target discussion harder," he said. I met his eyes. I raised it twice. In writing, silence. Not hostile, just factual. And when it wasn't adopted, he asked. I documented the variance. I replied. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You always document." "Yes." Another pause. "What changed?" he asked quietly. That was the real question. Not about the email, not about the board. About me. I realized. I said that protecting alignment without clarity eventually creates misalignment. He looked at me differently then, not as a subordinate, not as a support function, as a peer. "I didn't expect you to bring that thread into the boardroom," he admitted. "I didn't expect to need to," I replied. The honesty in that sentence hung between us, because that was the truth. If targets had been recalibrated transparently, the thread would have remained archived, quiet, irrelevant. But once performance became a question of operational accountability, context became necessary. "I wasn't trying to position you as responsible," he said. "I know," I replied. "But that's how it would have been interpreted." He nodded slowly. We sat there for a few seconds, not adversaries, not allies exactly, just two professionals acknowledging the recalibration. There was no apology script, no handshake resolution, just a shift in dynamic. From that day forward, something subtle changed in how he addressed me in meetings. Not warmer, not deferential, more precise. "Cato, from a projection standpoint, what does this imply? Let's confirm alignment before presenting." He stopped summarizing my points into simplified optimism. He allowed them to stand in their full context. And I stopped cushioning my language to protect momentum. Confrontation without heat doesn't feel cinematic. It feels surgical. Clean edges, minimal blood, and afterward, the room remains intact. We walked into the quarterly planning session together. Nothing outward had changed. But internally, the hierarchy had flattened. Not because I demanded it, because the sequence demanded it. If you had met me a year before the launch, you would have described me as steady. If you met me now, you would still say steady. But there's a difference between steadiness that absorbs and steadiness that defines. I'm still calm in meetings. I still take notes in my slim black leather notebook. I still ask measured questions instead of making grand declarations. What's changed isn't my personality, it's my perimeter. I no longer assume that silence will be interpreted generously. I no longer equate loyalty with containment, and I don't allow optimism to override structural clarity. That doesn't mean I've become combative. It means I've become explicit. When budgets change, I request target alignment in writing. When projections shift, I present both optimistic and constrained models side by side. When executives summarize strategy, I let nuance stand without softening it for comfort. Not to challenge authority, to protect accuracy. Interestingly, my reputation inside the company has evolved, but not in the way I expected. I'm no longer described as low drama. I'm described as rigorous, as protective of process, as someone who thinks 3 moves ahead. The board now asks for my perspective early, not reactively. Finance loops me into forecasting before targets are public. Sales validates numbers with me before building quota decks. No one announced this shift. It just settled into place. Daniel and I still work together, professionally, effectively. There's mutual respect now that didn't exist before, not because of friendship, but because boundaries are visible. He doesn't override projections without discussion. I don't assume alignment without documentation. We operate in clarity, and clarity, ironically, makes collaboration smoother. The most surprising part. I don't feel hardened. I don't carry resentment. I don't replay the boardroom moment in my head, because this wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to be inaccurately defined. For years, I believed my strength was in how much I could absorb without reacting. Now I understand my strength is in how precisely I can respond when it matters. Not loudly, not emotionally, correctly. If I'm honest, I'm grateful for that launch. Not for the tension. For the mirror, it showed me that being indispensable is not the same as being respected. And that respect doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity delivered at the right moment, in the right room. I am still calm, but now my calm has edges, and those edges are visible. When people hear this story, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending, a firing, a public apology, a triumphant speech. There wasn't one. No one was escorted out of the building. No heated emails circulated. No reputations were destroyed. What changed was quieter and more permanent. A narrative was corrected. Responsibility was placed where sequence proved it belonged. And the assumption that I would carry misalignment silently disappeared. If there's a lesson here, it isn't expose people. It isn't wait for revenge. And it certainly isn't never trust leadership. It's this: documentation is not aggression. Clarity is not betrayal. And silence is only weakness when it is unchosen. For a long time, I thought maturity meant absorbing discomfort to keep the peace. I believed that if I was calm enough, reasonable enough, invisible enough, the system would eventually reward integrity on its own. But systems don't correct themselves without information. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue, it's to present sequence. Not emotionally, not theatrically, just accurately. That single email I displayed wasn't a weapon. It was context. And context, when revealed without heat, forces rooms to recalibrate. If you've ever been the reliable one, the stabilizer, the absorber, the person everyone assumes will handle it, I want to leave you with this. You are allowed to be calm. You are allowed to be loyal. You are allowed to support a larger vision. But you are not required to carry decisions you did not make. Sometimes, quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about refusing to be misrepresented. So I'm curious, have you ever stayed silent in a room, knowing the full context, and wondered what would happen if you chose the exact right moment to speak?